Welcome to If Only You Knew, where each week we take a deep dive into the careers and experiences of people from different backgrounds, cultures, countries and ages to discuss pivotal moments in their lives and the lessons they have learnt along the way.
If they told people the truth, they wouldn't last very long.
Whether you're a school student in an established career, mapping your academic pathway, searching for the perfect career, looking to change careers, or just plain curious, then this podcast is for you. I'm your host, Christy McCormack, and I want to ask you, what would you do differently if only you knew? With me today is Gary Radford, a serial entrepreneur who has a passion for innovation and disruptive business models. With a diverse industry background, Gary has started and sold many successful businesses and helps others to do the same. Welcome, Gary, and thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Christy, and thanks for having me on.
Okay, now, Gary, I've been really keen to talk to you as you've had a lot of success in developing new businesses, growing the brands and then selling them. You are the definition of a serial entrepreneur and also a branding guru. So what is it about starting new businesses and brands that you enjoy so much?
I think it's the freshness of it. I like the idea of starting from scratch, moving into a market where perhaps it's become a little bit stale and trying to come up with a disruptive business model. I think I'm just much more suited to that fast growth, early pace type environment. And I like building things. I think I like having a brand that at some stage wasn't a thing and then suddenly is a thing and taking people on that journey.
So do you think you're a bit of an early adopter?
That's actually a really good question, because based on what I do for a living and even perhaps people's perception of my personality, you would think that. I think I'm a innovator personally in terms of what I try to grow, but it's interesting. I still wish I had my BlackBerry. So I don't tend to bring on personal technology myself too quickly, much to my children's chagrin. But when I go into a business, it's another thing. So I'm not sure how that dichotomous part of my personality came about.
Now, you've worked in all types of business structures, from startups to multinationals. How different are they?
That's a good question. There's some fundamental differences, and essentially it comes around scale, and there's pros and cons to both, and you can enjoy either model and have a good time in both, depending on, I guess, the culture and the people that you're working with. I think the fundamental difference is, and it's something I've learned a lot, especially recently, is there's a little bit of a shift required in culture from a private company to something that's trying to get to scale. But yeah, I think you can enjoy yourself in both environments. I certainly have. I've had private businesses where I've loved it and private businesses where I haven't loved it. And similarly, I've been in really big businesses where there's been a good culture and it's been fun as well.
So I was going to talk to you a bit about culture, because I think in startups it's easy to determine the culture because it's what you want it to be and it's really driven by the top. But how is culture and values implemented in a multinational, and how can different business models and those working within them learn from the different business structures and take the best of both worlds to mesh it into where they progress in their careers?
That's actually the best way to frame that discussion, the best of both worlds. And often I'm working on some theory stuff at the moment about when a private equity business, for example, or a scaled business takes on a privateer, being able to keep that small company agile culture, but implement systems that make it scalable. And I think it's actually the ultimate challenge. Culture itself, I would say one of the biggest learnings in my career is that leadership really matters. It's not just a buzzword. Even in a very big organisation, I've learned that the hard way, that I would have thought once a business got to a certain size, culture becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and a leader can maybe influence it 5, 10, maybe 15% when you get to scale. But I've completely turned my view around on that now. Culture definitely runs from the top. So you've got to have the right mindset to begin with, and you've got to bring people together who are like-minded. And culture is a buzzword as well. You've got to build a culture that suits every part of your business dynamic, the market you're in, the customers, the suppliers, what you're trying to do, your staff. There's not a one culture fits all approach. I think that's a bit of a myth.
So do you think culture is influenced by the hierarchical nature of a business?
Look, I think it's a multi-dimensional question. It can be influenced by the nature of the market itself. So like a tech type business is bound to inherently have a different culture than, say, a fast-moving consumer goods business, just by virtue of the fact of the personalities of the people that are likely to be attracted to those different markets. And then on top of that, I think it's the leaders understanding what type of culture is required, both in that particular industry, but also in another context that gets forgotten, in the context of what stage of growth that business is in. I've often broken businesses into 3 stages of growth. You start out as a racing car, so all of the effort needs to be put into going fast. You're going to break it a little bit, it'll get a bit messy. The analogy is the people driving the business have to keep their eyes on a small dashboard and not take their hands off the wheel or they'll hit the wall. Then you move into like a Sydney to Hobart yacht style business where you can move away from the steering wheel and adjust the trim and play with some of the details to get a bit more margin. And then you move into an oil tanker type business where you're at scale, and the real kind of driving premise that will dictate your outcomes is looking out for icebergs because you can't turn quickly. I think that gets really forgotten in especially growing a business. You can bring people into a racing car type culture from an oil tanker culture, and there can be a lot of shock there. So they're used to the brand doing a lot of the heavy lifting. They get frustrated at the lack of structure. Conversely, if you take a racing car type person who's probably more down my end of the spectrum, you go and put me into a Coca-Cola or a Coates Tire or a Lang O'Rourke, for example, and I'd probably not like it very much, and they probably wouldn't like me very much either. So I think it's horses for courses.
No, I think that's a perfect analogy, and I think it's definitely a learning curve when you move to the different business structures and how you can adapt yourself to the culture of the business and how you align to that. So just going back, this podcast has been discussing a lot about people's paths directly from high school, and you've talked a little bit about your nature and who you are. But what were you like through high school?
Oh, wow. Okay, so I think the most important part of my background is that my dad was like a project engineer, and we moved from place to place. So I ended up moving school 21 times. We lived overseas a lot. I think that drove my view of the world. And I think fundamentally what it did was made me realise that people can get boxed in to other people's perception of them. And the literal example is I would go to one school, and on day one, the coolest kid in school would want to kick the football with me. And so for the next 6 months, I was popular. I'd be the same kid in the next school, and the popular kid bumps into me in the hallway, and I'm a social pariah. So I think that really helped me have a bit of an entrepreneurial mindset. And I see people so often who are boxed into this almost caricature of themselves because it's how they've been treated their whole life. And circumstantially, they've never moved around and realised you can be whoever you want to be. And that, to me, that's what drives me. You can start fresh at any time. You can build a new thing. You can redefine yourself. You can move on. And you can change everything in the blink of an eye. So I think that's what's driven me probably from as long as I can remember. The other thing I would say is what that's pushed me towards is understanding that we're all still monkeys, and that helps me a lot in business. I realise there's a lot of that biologically programmed behaviour that goes into building a business, and trying to manage and massage those behaviours and extract people's discretionary effort is important. And that psychology is the most important thing in leadership, I think. There's no one leadership style that works. The key to leadership, as far as I can tell, is understanding that there is no one leadership style that will work, because you're going to be different to me, we're going to be different to someone else. A good leader will adjust their style to suit that, to get the best out of the person. And that came from some tough challenges in my childhood as well. And my mother had a very significant mental illness, and that ended up indirectly taking her life. And I think that really forged my view that everything we do is driven by our base of psychology, and don't get too caught up in the technical aspects of business, because at the end of the day, it'll all be driven by how people feel.
Now, you joke on your LinkedIn profile that the GM of operations for your current company went to Harvard, but you've been equally successful without, I suppose, taking that academic route. So what would you say to the listeners who have that drive to succeed but don't have that elusive degree?
Here's where you and I are quite different, right? You've made a very big effort to educate yourself. I'm probably just manifestly lazier than you. It's probably evidence of what I said before. I struggle in a structured environment. I love learning, passionately love learning, and I hate school. So I think you've got to find a way to educate yourself. I think there's enormous value in formal education if you can do it. And I think that you could either do that first and then go into business, or you can start working and then do your degree, which brings context. I think at the end of the day, my advice to people would be don't do the degree to get the letters after your name. There's massive value in the right type of education. So if you're doing it to genuinely learn, go your hardest. And if you are disciplined enough to learn in that structured environment, unlike me, then I highly recommend it. Other than that, find ways to teach yourself. So one of the key leadership paradigms is you've got to manage yourself as well. And to do that, you've got to understand your strengths and weaknesses. And if I need to educate myself in a non-formal way, I've got to be conscious of that. So watching me try to study is pretty funny, I'll have to say.
I agree. I think definitely people learn in different ways, and some people will learn better in that sort of structured environment, and other people can just jump right in and learn as they go. And I believe you did that when you started working, and you progressed quite quickly in the roles that you're in. So what attribute do you think that you had to be able to do that?
Firstly, I have to confess to saying that I moved into the Brambles organisation as a junior, and there was a lot of luck. So I have to be honest about that. The business was in a situation where it was quite unstructured, going through a lot of change, and I got thrown into a lot of jobs that I had no right to be in. And I think I just was too dumb to know I shouldn't be there. And I just tried my best. And once again, I think the hangover of moving school 21 times was I was just used to being the new kid and adapting and fitting in and learning. And I also got to learn off an enormous amount of really smart people without having to do that university type structured learning process. So there was an element of luck, and I'm sure a part of my personality is suited to that style as well, that get thrown in the pool and if you don't swim, you'll drown type scenario. And then the last part is I'll say, look, there's something that I could never take credit for in my career, and that is the luck surrounding the type of people I've happened to bump into. I don't know how I do it, but I always tend to bump into the right people at the right time. And I had some mentors that probably out of sheer pity took me under their wing and taught me some incredible things, and probably made allowances for my learning style, which is I need to understand an entire system in context to be able to understand a small part of it. But there's people there like Richard Greenwood, who's still in the rental industry, Mark Rich, those sort of guys that just, I don't know, felt sorry for me, I think, and pulled me aside every now and then and told me when I was making massive errors. And I'll give myself some credit. I think I'm humble enough to take criticism. That's a really important character trait, I think. You can't take yourself too seriously, and you've got to build a really healthy relationship with criticism. I think that will almost define you on both ends of the scale. Make sure you don't take on criticism that's invalid, and make sure you don't ignore consistent criticism that you're getting that represents an opportunity to grow. I think I would nearly say that's a foundation of personal growth, that one.
So did it take you a while to be able to come to the realization of what criticisms you should take on board and the others that you can just leave at the door?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's also a byproduct of not being able to be disciplined in that formal structured learning environment. I had to learn a lot of stuff on the fly, but that one was critical. And over time, I developed a few systems in my head on how to filter criticism. I did write an article on LinkedIn about this, actually, that goes into how I formally do it. So I look at the person who's criticising me. Does this person know what they're talking about in this field, and should I shut up and listen? What do I think this person's motivations are? Do they have some sort of issue with me? Do they like me too much? And triangulate as well. Is this criticism being levelled at me now if I remove the emotion of it? Is it something I'm hearing all over the place? And if it is, it's time to stop and take stock and maybe see it as an opportunity for growth. And I think that comes into as well, another thing I learned early was, because I'm a really massive introvert, most people wouldn't pick that in me because I've got a big mouth and I'm rather opinionated. But I'm an introvert who likes people, but I learned early that I had to build a character to play at work, and that kind of insulated me from the stresses of needing to be extroverted in the workplace, and also the shell of that criticism as well. So I would think, okay, here's the role I'm playing, here's the character traits of this leader. Don't take it personally, try and grow and develop along the way.
Now, you cut your teeth working for a large organisation with Brambles, and then you went on to found your own business that specialised in the delivery of services to government and semi-government utilities. What was the catalyst for you to take that leap, to leave, large organisation and to go out on your own?
Easy one, and probably a reflection of my impulsive personality as well. So in my head, I was going to be on the board of Brambles or something like that. I was going to I grew up in a caravan park, so I carried a chip on my shoulder, and I thought I was going to be Gordon Gekko with more ethics than that, I suppose. I saw myself in the boardroom with a big suit, and then one day I read Robert Kiyosaki's book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and the next day I resigned. So it was that simple. It was an absolutely life-changing moment for me. I realised immediately that you're never going to get what you want to get working for wages. That's not a fair thing to say. I was never going to get what I wanted to get working for wages. And it was such a life-changing moment. I cashed in my options that I had with Brambles. I had $100,000 cash in my early 20s. I got on a plane and went to Singapore and went through the yellow pages looking for suppliers of certain types of equipment. The first one that agreed to pick me up from the airport, I threw them a $100,000 check and said, I'm your distributor. So
wow.
Sounds mental now. I wouldn't do it now.
So you don't recommend it to anybody else, but it was very successful for you. But how nerve-wracking was that to do it? Or did you do it that quickly that you didn't really have time to think?
Not nerve-wracking at all, believe it or not. When I can look back on my younger self now and say, holy cow, what was wrong with you? But at the time, I think I intuitively knew the only thing you can't buy in life is time. So if you're going to have a go, get after it young, throw all your cards on the table and try as hard as you can, because the worst thing that can happen is you'll go back to zero perhaps from a resources perspective at worst case scenario, but the learnings you'll make along the way will outweigh any financial losses you'll make. And also probably my personality, as I said, is I'd rather jump in the pool and see if I can swim, and I get more motivated by that. I used to get up every day saying, if I don't get this order, I'm broke. And it was a really good motivator. And then a turning point in the career with Xstrata, actually, as a gentleman called Gary Radford, who was an engineer from Xstrata, who once again, I think, felt sorry for me and threw me a purchase order that I had no right to receive. And I worried about how to resource that purchase order after I'd received it. And touch wood, we did well. And Graham Rattenbury went on to recommend me to all manner of very large organisations, and that was the catalyst moment where it ran away down a hill. So once again, right people, right time. Must have looked pathetic enough for them to take pity on me, and away we go.
You obviously did deliver because you were able to secure a number of large government contracts as a relatively new business. How did you go about that, and how were you able to deliver to the government, being basically a startup?
I think I deconstruct the world in my head down to a human level. And I figure if someone else can do it, why can't we do it? Do you know what I mean? And I think that's the only way to look at the world. I think the risk of not looking at it that way is you see other people as having some special, unique talent that you can't get, or some organisation being better at something. You can learn and grow, and you can usually talk your way into collaboration if you haven't got the resources yourself. If you have the opportunity first, it's like that if you build it, they will come type scenario. I had a big fat purchase order in my hand, so I knew I could encourage people to assist me in delivering that. And I knew if I executed properly that I would get more and more contracts. So I think the other advantage in that mindset was I always look 5 years down the track. And it makes me never stress about today. I just see today as a series of processes that I have to knock over in the context of that broader 5-year strategy. But as I talk, I'm remembering the individuals within these big government organisations, by the way, and I think they weren't silly. They knew that I was under-resourced, and they knew that they were going to have to be flexible. So, yeah, maybe you're teaching me during this podcast that my whole life has been about people feeling sorry for me. So,
Oh, I'm not. That's not the intention of this podcast.
No, it has been that way. I think people generally like people who are having a go. I've learned that people will respond and they'll even let you make mistakes. Like in a growing business, if you're transparent with your staff and your suppliers and your customers, and they see you at least as reasonably competent, they will make many more allowances, because I think most people, I guess from a personality perspective, are going to enjoy engaging with that type of dynamic, that get out and have a go type thing, because it's like athletics, right? There's a rugby league or a world netball champion or an Olympic person or an Elon Musk in all of us trying to bust out. And I think when you see someone having a crack, there's a part of you that, for most people anyway, have a good on you type attitude inside yourself. And I think that's what's kept me optimistic. There's been people along the way, and you'll get this, different people take different attitudes to other people doing well. And sometimes you'll get a bit of bigger boat syndrome. You watch Usain Bolt win the 100 metres, not even remotely comparing myself to him, by the way. But if you watch someone do something exceptionally well, it's difficult to really look into the work that went into that. And so some people can see that as that person just came out of the egg like that. They don't see the blood, sweat and tears and pain that went into it. And other people do. And if you can align yourself with the people that know you had to trip over a lot to get where you are, then they'll tend to make allowances and they'll be cheerleaders, I think. You got to surround yourself with cheerleaders. You got to be humble when you trip over on your face and laugh about it. And then those people will usually want you to win. And it's very difficult to win unless you're surrounded by people who want you to win.
So talking about people that want you to win, when you go into a new business, it's very daunting. There's a lot of things you have to do everything. So were you able to identify the gaps of things that you weren't able to do, and how easily were you able to bring in people to help you in the areas that you weren't as proficient in?
Oh, look, I'm more than aware of my weaknesses, and I've never had a problem being open about that and getting people to come in and help. That was just intuitive to me. I just think it's dumb otherwise. I think your ego will destroy you. You've got to understand that there's no such thing as a solo sport, really. You look at, I'm sure Roger Federer, perhaps the most ultimate solo sport on paper, would tell you there's a whole team of people behind him that make it possible. You just can't do anything alone. Even if you could, I think independence is overrated, Christy. I think when I was younger, I used to strive for independence, and it was almost like a driving force, not needing to need anyone. And I quickly realised you can possibly succeed on your own, but what's the point? You got no one to share it with. That was a big learning to me in my career, is that independence is overrated. It's much more fun to build something as a team. And the stories you end up talking about at the end of the day, whether you win, lose or draw, are the times you either massively failed or nearly failed and pulled it out of the fire. You don't sit there and go, how awesome were we to get that contract? You sit around and say, remember when I called that purchasing lady from CBI accidentally a effing something because I thought she was someone else? Those are the stories that carry you, and people like that, I think. And I think that, that probably came from my granddad. That the humility and the empathy part is what's going to draw people to you. The thing about business, though, there's only one real scary thing about working for yourself, and it's cash flow. It's terrifying. I can remember, outside of the joys in my career, I can remember sitting on the couch, sucking my thumb, rocking backwards and forwards, saying, geez, I hope Select Plant High Pay tomorrow or the ATO is going to kick the door in. So those moments are very character building. I'm sure they take years off your life. And it is a big thing. That is a big thing. People working in an organisation, they say, I could do this better, I'm better at this and I'm better at that. The hard part is the cash flow. So brace yourself if you're going to jump in and do something, because that's the scary bit.
So do you think that would be the biggest learning curve in business, is to be able to manage that cash flow and to be able to do it properly?
I don't know if there is such a thing as the biggest learning curve, because I think you can win in a number of ways. You can work into a commoditized space and be more efficient, and those personalities that are much more driven towards detail and efficiency can succeed in a commoditized market. People who are a little bit more creative can succeed by maybe failing on the detail end, but making up for it because they've innovated or created something that people are prepared to pay more money for, which makes up for that cash flow gap. I think it's just the stress of the cash flow you have to brace yourself for. Like, it does sometimes feel like the world's going to fall on your head, and you've got to learn to manage that one. Everyone's brave. What did Mike Tyson say? Everyone's brave until they get punched in the mouth. In business, everyone's brave until their own house is on the line. So,
yeah, that's exactly right. But you ran that business for a few years and then you went on to sell it. So how did the sale come about, and how did you deal with the emotional and personal connection to that business?
That's a really critical question. So talk about learnings in business. Don't fall in love with your business. So people think that, I hear people say it all the time, I love this place, I poured my blood, sweat and tears into it. I would suggest to people, try and jump out of that thought process, because you're not in love with the business. You're in love with what you did in the business. You're in love with the people you had in the business. The business is just a sticker on the roof. In terms of the actual sale coming about, the first significant sale that I was a part of, we had built a business model that was quite unique, extremely effective, and we grew through the GFC. And we were the only company in our space that grew through the GFC. And we just suddenly got circled by a lot of other organisations who were looking to bolt businesses onto theirs. I think we had 9 approaches, something like that at the time.
Wow.
And it wasn't necessarily my intent to sell. I don't think I thought that much into it. But once I had gone through that process, so the due diligence process in selling a business that was at that size, I think we had 110 staff or something like that. That was a university education in and of itself. So I really hated and enjoyed that. Talk about mentors as well. There's a guy who's actually the CFO now for Premier Hire. You should interview him. He's a cool dude. His name's Scott McDougall, and he really held my hand through that due diligence process, and I'm sure he's got some hilarious, humbling tales to tell about me during that. I really enjoyed that. Regardless of what happened before or after, the due diligence process was great. And I was lucky enough to take most of the people that I'd grown close to during growing that business into the new business. And subsequently, even today, a lot of those people have come with me on different journeys. And I would say that's the thing I'm most proud of in my career. Some people that I've worked with have gone off and done their own thing. That makes me really proud and been very successful. And other people have, through some sort of personality disorder, stayed with me. So I've really enjoyed that process.
So one of your skills is creating really strong brands, and you're a savvy marketer. So how did you think that you developed these skills, and how important do you think that those skills are within a business?
I spent a lot of my career wondering how someone as useless as me can grow businesses. I sincerely mean that. I couldn't figure it out because I'm not a technician. I don't have a trade. I'm not overly formally qualified. And I realised with the help of someone else at one stage that I've really only got one core skill, and that's synthesis. If you can give me a complex idea, I have a skill of being able to turn it into an understandable premise. And it took me a long time to realise that's actually a very powerful skill. So I worked very hard on simplifying everything. So breaking a business down into daily behavioural activities, and then that flies into the marketing side as well. How do I build what we're trying to do here into a story that people will quickly and easily absorb? And that process, the process of building everything into a process became innate to me. So I would just sit back and say, what are we doing here? What's the fundamental premise of this story? Who's our audience? How are they used to absorbing information? And then go from there.
Because your brands are really unique. So how do you come up with the names, the logos, the taglines, and just the brand image as a whole?
I had a discussion with a colleague about this once, and we tried to break down what the essence of this process was. And his conclusion was that I'm just a wanker. So I think there's something in that. I think I'm a big fan of the fact that design matters, that being memorable in a fast-growing business matters. I think, once again, a process of that humility that was beaten into me by my grandfather is, so if I come and see you and you're a potential customer, the first thing in my head is, You've got a day job. You do not give a rat's ass about my business. How can I capture your attention quickly and without wasting your time? What's the old marketing question? Who are you? What do you do? And why should I care? So I really try and punch through those questions as quickly as I can. Give me a chance to participate. Who's this person I'm about to meet? How are they used to receiving information? And how do I humbly get an opportunity to show my wares to them? And I think that's the starting premise. And in terms of the design, and I like cool things or wanky things, whatever you want to call them. I like motorbikes. I like American football. I love design. I'm really into aesthetics. I'm always impressed by really creative people. And I know that leaves an impression and a psychological mark on people. So if you go in and say, I'm from ABC Proprietary Limited, good luck. That you still get there, but I think it'll take longer. But if you go in and say, I'm from, I don't know, insert ridiculous name that I've thought up along the way, people tend to remember it, and it tends to be polarizing. But for the most part, I think if you can tap into people's sense of design or even sense of humor, I think I've tapped into a lot in my later career, people will engage with you on that human level, I think.
Now, look, I'm not calling it ridiculous, but Can you explain the tagline, Fear the Fish? Okay,
so not really. That kind of evolved in and of itself. It's more of a, I guess, a tongue-in-cheek, what would you call it? A tongue-in-cheek battle cry to our people and our competitors, really. So I've got a pretty good relationship with our competitors generally. They see me as a bit of a pain in the ass, but I like to build a rapport with them as well, because I think we're all in the same thing together, and I really enjoy that friendly competition. So the Fear the Fish thing was trying to tie a battle cry around the Vortex group that signaled our intent. So Vortex is a fast growth engine that's backed by private equity that obviously has an exit in mind. Mm-hmm. And a key in that is building sustainable revenue streams, bringing people on, keeping them, those racing car type people, and signaling to the market, suppliers, customers, competitors, that we're here to go hard and build something that lasts a long time. So I think Fear the Fish kind of encapsulated it. But I have to confess, that wasn't some big sit-down strategy session. I think that just popped out of my head somewhere.
I love it because it just makes you ask. It makes you ask the question. I'm sure it's a good starting point when you're going into different organisations. I'm sure they ask, what is it and what's it about?
I think that is a fantastic point. So turning your brand or some part of your brand into a conversation starter. So we've got that Fushstart brand, which obviously looks like another word on paper. And at the end of nearly every meeting I have with a customer now, they say, I have to ask you, and then I know what they're about to ask. So I think that's fantastic to have something that leaves a mark in people's minds. When I threw my brands into this Vortex pie, their probably primary leading brand was a business called Pumps United, which was absolutely fantastic from an execution perspective. Very strong operational business, very loyal customers, but branding and business development wasn't their strong point. And a thing that will stick in my memory forever is when I first flew to Melbourne to go and see the Melbourne crew from Pumps United, I turned up at a business called United Pumps. So I worked for the group and I went to the wrong business. So that reinforced to me, I think it's important to stand out. So you imagine the flow-on effect of that. The customers are not going to remember. You're going to be driven by the efforts of your operational team and the personality of your sales team, which can all be effective, but it's slower. Fear the Fish, people remember it, all that sort of stuff.
Absolutely, definitely. I think, being a conversation starter is really important. But you also place a lot of importance on customer service. How integral do you think customer service is to the success that you've had in business and to success of businesses all around the world?
It's everything. Marketing and sales, you'll get the fish in the boat, right? Getting them to come back is what matters, and that operational execution. So every time I start a business, the first thing I do is build a chronological map of the customer's decision-making process, broken into 3 areas. First part is the strategic platform, which is what type of business are you? Then there's the engine, which is what you're talking about now, which is the customer experience. How do they experience it through the touch points in your business? And how do you break that into measurable behaviours? And then the last part's the offer. So you should always be able to get market price. So say you've got a product, if the market price is $10, you should get $10. If your customer service, branding, and kind of brand value or feel the customer likes and wants to deal with you, that'll get you anywhere from last right of refusal, here's the competitor's price, can you match it, through to about 5% these days, but it's critical. And then that last piece, that extra, the $2.50 I call it, the $2.50, where let's say I can save you $5 in fuel or something like that, or some other quantifiable value proposition, and I'll go you halves in that. To me, the entire business is about getting to that $2.50, because that's what will add value to your business all the way along. It will increase your margin, it will make your customers sticky, and more importantly, that's what people will buy when they buy your business. It's that strategic piece that matters. I did go down a rabbit hole a bit there and went away from your original question, but that engine customer service piece is really, that's what will build your rapport with the customer, and it will create what the customer feels about your business. And it matters. I know I keep coming back to this point about the emotion and the psychology, and I often get ridiculed for this in a kind of a polite way, but I spent my whole career trying to move away from the fact that I thought I was going to get to private equity land or some big board meeting and there was this magic black box trick I was going to be taught that no one showed me in the caravan park. But by the time I got there, I realised I knew everything I needed to know in the caravan park, at least in that respect. What's going to grow a business? People want to call it sentimental. They want to throw a different, more clinical word around it, but it's love. It really is. If you love what you do, you can surround yourself with people who love you and you love them. Your customers love you, your suppliers love you. It's very difficult. You have to be pretty incompetent from that point on to not succeed if you've got that dynamic right. So if your staff love what they're doing, it's a cliche, they'll be engaged, the customers will smell that, and the customers will become advocates. That's culture, and everything else flows downhill. You can feel it. You think about the last time you went to a business and you just went, wow, that service was great. It's not really the business model. It's that the person working there obviously loves working there.
So what do you look for when you're employing staff?
Well, that's a really good question. So my favourite question in an interview is, tell me how you're mental. And the answer to, because we're all mental, and the answer to that question usually tells me everything I know about the person. You'll get people who refuse to answer the question. You'll get people who are shocked by it and laugh about it. And then you'll get people who are really open. And I love the last people. I like weirdos. I really love misfits. I really have, in the Vortex group at the moment in particular, in the context of that venture, there's a lot of weirdos. There's a lot of very competent, strange people, and I call it a home for lost boys and girls. So it's really enjoyable, and I've never been in a group before where there's more people. There's 220 of us now, wow. And I've never been in a group before where there's more people that I would happily take to another business. And I think that's a function of bringing in the lunatics, for want of a better phrase.
That's amazing, though, because generally in larger businesses, you don't find that. You don't find that camaraderie. You don't find that amount of people that you would actually want to work with in the future. So to be in a group that happens, that's amazing.
It's the only thing you've got. So if I'm, say, Vortex is coming up against Coates or a Greco or someone like that, they're 15 or 16 times bigger than us. They've got infinitely more resources. If they wanted to step on us, they could. So the only thing that's going to differentiate us at the customer-facing point of view is how the customer feels about us and our brains. So you get forced into a situation where you build a siege mentality. And we get new people come into the business, and we really make an effort to bring people from outside the industry as well. And you'll go into a job and they'll say, I hear this phrase all the time. We're up against Coates, we're up against the Greco, we're up against Cummins, we're up against Caterpillar. And I say, no, you're not. When we go in to talk to this customer, it's me and you against two dudes from Caterpillar. That's what you're up against. They've already assumed that we've got the resources to service the job. We're at scale. We don't need to be the biggest company in Australia to be big enough to service a tier 1 B2B. We just need to be big enough. And that kind of brings it back to, if that's the case, what's the point in us going in there and being the same boring cat type? That's a bit mean. I love cat, by the way. Good for Caterpillar. Please don't do me.
Shout out to Pat.
Well, you get my point. What's the point
absolutely.
of walking in and being the same button-down white shirt with a logo on it, the same brochure, describing your strategy as being customer service, which is something that makes me go insane on a daily basis? You're not going to win. You've got to stand out.
So speaking of those larger organisations, you actually sold one of your businesses to a very large national organisation within Australia, and you went on to work for them for 6 years. How did you find that, after obviously coming from it being your own business, selling it into a large organisation and seeing them run it? How did you deal with that?
I think in the beginning it was easy because it was a racing car. Despite its scale, it was looking to get to mega scale. So everything was fast. I enjoyed it. It was a go. The broader investors were very open to entrepreneurial type leadership. There was a very strong trust culture in that business, and that was the key to the growth. And once again, the customers smelled it. We had a great crew. Everyone wanted to go fast. We were absorbing acquisitions of other private type businesses at the time. So we were bolting all these private cultures on and trying to work together, trying to retain that entrepreneurial spirit while giving the customer the risk mitigation that comes from being at scale. And it worked well for a really long time. My view as to when it became more challenging is when I think the ownership group perhaps lost its way in not remembering where we came from. So we probably didn't do as great a job as we might have in transitioning from the race car model to the Sydney to Hobart yacht model and then to that oil tanker model. And I don't begrudge the organisation that, because everywhere I've been since, there's not a strong understanding of the critical nature of that. It's almost the first thing you need to ask yourself before you do anything in a business. What stage of our growth are we at? Are we a racing car business? Are we a Sydney to Hobart yacht, or are we an oil tanker? And that drives nearly everything you do. When you go and employ someone, like you said before, I want to know how you're mental, but I'm really trying to find out also, are you a racing car person or are you an oil tanker person? If you're an oil tanker person, you'll hate me. So I've got to make sure that all flows together as well.
Yeah, so you're surrounding yourself with a similar sort of person that wants the same outcomes.
I think so, and I think always remembering that stage of the growth that you're in. And even in the Vortex group at the moment, we've had challenges with that. And I'm constantly I send emails out to the whole group regularly around this topic. So I'll send a list of things you're likely to hate in an organisation that's a racing car. And then I'll say, don't worry, all this stuff you're whinging about is just normal. Shut up and do a thing. And that brings people back to earth. They go, yeah, I am frustrated that this is a bit loose and there's no formal structure here and blah, blah, blah. But the flip side of that is I'm in an entrepreneurial culture. I'm well trusted. I can pretty much do what I want to do. We plan through the windscreen and manage through the rear view mirror. So we allow people to make mistakes and mop up after them. So you've got to constantly remind people that there's pros and cons. It's not necessarily better to work in a Vortex type organisation than it is to work at Coates. It's just really different. And during the real growth phase of I guess the bigger organisation I've worked in historically, when we lost sight of that fact, it became a case of too many mixed messages. We were doing some things that were suited to a racing car and implementing other things that was to an oil tanker, and that created some really negative outcomes for people, I think.
So do you think people are able to go from, say, being a racing car personality when they start with an organisation and then through the growth, go right through to the oil tanker, but then pull back again if they move into a different organisation? Or do you think that you just inherently are who you are?
I think you're going to have to interview someone a bit smarter to properly answer that question. I can give you my layman's view. I think you're going to have a chunk of your personality that either feels safe and warm and effective in a structured environment, or is a bit of a lunatic and likes to get after it and likes to be a bigger fish in a smaller pond. I really think there are some inherent characteristics that lend you to a racing car versus an oil tanker especially. Most people can work in that middle space because there's a bit of flex. And if you wanted to build a model, say, for taking a business through that whole journey, you may have a groundswell of particularly administrative and operational people that are suited to all levels, but you'll always have a leadership style, and certainly the sales part of your business will be driven towards flexibility. Believe it or not, my view is the critical role in an organisation relative to what stage of its growth journey it's in is the CFO. So Scott McDougall and people like that have shown me that a racing car bent understanding, at least from a CFO, is so important in a fast-growing business. If you bring more of a traditional bean counter into that business, you can really strangle it. So if I'm in a racing car business, I look at my financial people and I say, got bad news for you guys. I know you like numbers and calculators, but you're going to have to mop up after a whole bunch of mental people, and I just need you to mop up. You're going to have to make up for the fact these people are going to drive you nuts, but at this stage of our growth, I need you to be understanding. So that's where I'd start.
That's really interesting, because most people would look to the COO or the CEO as probably the most important sort of piece in that puzzle, but to explain it in that way with the CFO, because they really are one way or another, in my experience. So how difficult have you found it to get a CFO that's been able to bend and shift towards the mental side of the businesses?
I've only met a couple in my career. They're very rare beasts, and I've become quite obsessed with this fact now. I really think that there's some of the most understated rare animals in business. There's a couple of financial people in the Vortex group, obviously, and also in the Carnegie part of the business, which is the private equity animal behind Vortex, that I don't know what you would call them. Best analogy is my son is a really creative guy, but he's also very physical and he's a massive introvert. He calls himself a nerd with muscle. And I think that's the kind of CFO you want a bit of it. You want a nerd who likes skydiving, I think, something like that.
No, that's perfect, because I think the financial guy is also, or woman, is very critical to business success. So what is your advice to businesses that are looking to sell, whether it to be to another organisation or private equity, into setting the right financial structure up?
Critical question. I think I'll start at the beginning there with a quick statement. My view is only ever get into business to get out, especially today. Specialization is for insects. Technology moves so quickly that the biggest risk you'll have in business is holding your business too long. You've got to sell it, scale it, move on and do something else, cash in on that goodwill, put some money in the bank and go on to another thing. In terms of setting up for exit, I think every single business should be set up for exit from day one, and it should be their constant reference point. By definition, if you've got a business that's valuable from a potential acquirer's perspective, you've got a business that's valuable. So you should always be looking at the end from the beginning. Why would someone buy this business? And it'll throw up a lot of critical discussion points that will drive your behaviour. They'll want sustainable, sticky revenue. They'll want staff engagement. They'll want customer advocacy, all those sort of things. So if someone's prepared to buy your business, you've built a great business. So you should start your business assuming you're going to sell it, I think.
Do you think that's why a lot of smaller businesses don't survive, because they don't set up with that structure to start with, or that mindset?
I think so. I think a lot of people, and look, there's different schools of thought on this. I've got a lot of friends who own businesses who've held them and they can't imagine letting go of them. And that's not necessarily the wrong approach. You look at people like Peter Giberis from Premier, you definitely need to interview him. He's a fascinating character. Greg Pugh from Jenny Light, those sort of guys that have bought and held on, that have a different perspective on this. I don't think it's necessarily why businesses fail, but I think as you go forward, it definitely will be. I think the way technology is evolving, not just straight out technology, like I used to walk around the workshop all the time holding up my mobile phone saying someone's about to invent a generator that's 500 kVA that's this size, so stay afraid, right? I always want to stay afraid of potential innovation in the market, and then that motivates you to innovate yourself and it motivates you to get to scale and move on. And I think if you look at the COVID situation at the moment, no one could have predicted that, but I think the big learning out of this situation is things can change in the blink of an eye. So I would be encouraging most small business owners to be seeking help early on from people who have sold before, at least to structure their business. And even then, if they don't sell, they're in a healthy position where the business is saleable and by definition more valuable to themselves. But yeah, I'm the sort of guy who, if you tell me I would never sell, if you said to me I'd never sell my business, I would cringe. I'd find that difficult. I admire it, but it makes me feel nervous. I just see a future where it's, whoops, someone invented a thing that was better than my thing and now I don't have a thing. Like, I think fear is a powerful motivator for me in business.
Absolutely. And as someone that looks ahead, as you said before, 5 years, what's next for Gary?
Lots of things, actually. So a shift in my thinking is I never want to have all my eggs in one basket at any one time, both for risk mitigation purposes, opportunity purposes, and also not getting bored. I spend a lot more time in the strategic space at the moment. I like being creative. I like the branding. I like new things. So I'll always have a lot of things going on around the place. And I've moved into a lot more consulting type work as well, or at least advisory stuff. I'm on a few different boards in industries I've never been in before, learning a lot. And it's also teaching me probably the thing I was taught from moving around so much as a kid, that just like most people are pretty much the same, most businesses are pretty much the same. The fundamental principles are identical, whether you're selling marshmallows or excavators. So for me going forward, it'll be about diversity. I've got quite a few ideas in the back burners around apps and using technology to harness data rather than dealing in physical machines and things like that. And I really want to turn what I've learned around scaling, selling a business, keeping the entrepreneurial spirit, larger organisation while getting the benefits of scale into some sort of system or a book or something like that.
Now, as someone that looks forward continually, I have to just take you back and ask you, what would you do differently if only you knew?
You haven't got a long enough podcast, honestly. What would I do differently if only... Geez, you gave me goosebumps then. That made me hate myself. Geez, what would I do differently? There's the philosophical answer, which is I'm really, really happy. I'm surrounded by people that I really love and that really take care of me. So it would be difficult to ignore that butterfly effect, that if any error I'd made in the past I made up for somehow, it might have changed the outcome. So I think I've enjoyed the mistakes I've made. I think it's the reason that I've ended up happy, I think, by stuffing up. So I don't know that I would necessarily change anything. I'd probably make sure I was a lot more consistent in my physical health. I think any given day I'm bouncing around by 20 or 30 kilos, and I'd probably be a bit more consistent in that. At least I've got COVID as an excuse now. But no, other than that, I'd stay focused on the core principles for me, which is my grandfather had this theory around 3 pillars. You've got your family or your personal life, you've got your physical health, and you've got your career. Neglecting any one of those will wreck the other 2. So it's easy to fall into a trap of that life balance thing. It's very cliched, but it's so important. If you're unhealthy, you'll be a worse husband or wife and dad, and you won't work as hard. If you're too focused on work, that they all interplay. You've really got to make sure you split up specific parts of your day around your family, your work, and your physical health. And I think that's the key.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a key, and it's also probably one of the most difficult things to do.
If not the most difficult thing to do. And that's why you've got to surround yourself with people who are prepared to criticise you. My third eldest, who'll definitely either be Prime Minister or a serial killer, he was interviewing me for something at school about business, and he said, what would you say is the number one key to what you've done in your business life? And I said, I always try and be the dumbest guy in the room. And his answer was, well, you're killing it, Dad. So
I love it.
So having that kind of grounding people around you that are prepared, you've got to never forget how ridiculous you are. You're ridiculous. It doesn't matter. And you can be ridiculous in a Range Rover, or you can be ridiculous in a tent. You've got to not take yourself too seriously, I think.
That's awesome advice. And Gary, you have given us so many great insights today that I couldn't even try and list them all. So I really thank you for taking the time to chat with me today. And I'm going to have all your information on our website so people can follow you on LinkedIn and look at the brands that we're talking about and fear the fish. And I wish you all the success in the world going forward. So thanks for your time, Gary.
You too, Christy, and congratulations. You're exactly the sort of person that should be doing this. Someone should be interviewing you shortly.
No, thanks. Okay, so if you'd like to know more about Gary, feel free to follow him on LinkedIn. As I said, and all his brands will be there so you can understand what we've been talking about today. And his full bio will be available on our website, ifonlyyouKnewpodcast.com.au. Thanks, Gary.
Thank you, Christy.
For more information about our guests or our show, visit ifonlyyouKnewpodcast.com.au.